Powers lay motionless on the rooftop, eyes half closed beneath the white blaze of the noon sun. The radiation-soaked light beat down on the concrete like a slow drum. Around him, the city was in ruin. Buildings crumbling, streets flooded, and weeds pushing through fissured asphalt. Time itself seemed to slow here. Days had grown longer, unnaturally so. The earth was tilting towards sleep. In the sky, no aircraft flew, no birds cried. Even the insects had stilled. Below, in the laboratory submerged by creeping waters and coral growths, Dr. Whitby slept in his sealed tank, his metabolism halted, cocooned in liquid suspension. He had stopped his body's processes entirely, choosing a silence so deep it bordered on death. He was one of many, scientists, thinkers, visionaries, who had voluntarily shut themselves down, retreating from a world spinning out of order. The stars had gone quiet, the sun was shrinking. Something in the universe had reversed. Powers had chosen to remain awake, to watch, to count the days as they elongated, dragging like kelp strands in slow current. Each morning, he read the messages, scratched into surfaces, whispered through strange sleep murmurs. All around the earth, others were hearing them too. Voices, symbols, dreams, each voice different, but somehow the same. Down in the half-submerged rooms of the aquarium, Powers would wander, flashlight trembling over the glass tanks now filled with algae and barnacles. Fish had long since died or mutated. Some tanks glowed faintly, emitting low sounds like distant tides. The glyphs on the walls, first thought to be decorative or marine research notations, now pulsed with rhythmic significance. Circles within spirals, lines like veins of coral. He knew the symbols weren't human, nor were they animal. They came from something else, something dreaming within the water, older than man, older than stars. Each day, Powers felt more distant from his own past. His memories loosened. What year it was didn't matter anymore. What had caused the shift? Radiation, celestial movement, or some universal decay had stopped being the point. Time itself was becoming a presence, a shape, a voice. He would sleep, and in those dreams he would see a great sea, stretching forever. He floated on its surface, the sky cracked above him, symbols raining down like jellyfish. Each touch was a command, each glyph a fossil of a thought not his own. And then he'd wake, drenched in sweat, breathing shallow. Out in the drained swimming pool behind the research facility, a strange cactus had sprouted. It had grown rapidly, its spines sharp and geometric. No one had planted it, no one watered it, but it thrived, and it bore names. One by one, over the days, names began to appear carved into the bark. Scientists, thinkers, artists, people who had chosen to sleep. Some were still alive in their biosuspension tanks. Others had already died. But the names appeared before the fact, always a few days early, etched into the green body of the plant in exact, even letters. Then came Powers' name. He stared at it for a long time, felt no fear, only inevitability. It was as if the plant had reached forward in time, dipped its needles into the future, and recorded what was waiting. He tried not to think about it. He wandered deeper into the aquarium's lower chambers, now entirely underwater, using a small air tank to descend into rooms filled with coral and slow-moving lights. One chamber was particularly strange. The walls there were covered in glyphs far more complex, shifting patterns, never quite the same when you looked again. There was a hum. There was a hum. Not from machinery long since dead, but from the room itself, like something dormant was breathing. He floated there, still, and the voices began again. Clearer this time. End of structure. End of self. Sleep. It wasn't language in the strict sense, it was sensation. Meaning pressed against his thoughts like a tide against a shell. He wanted to resist. But there was peace in it. The Earth itself was slowing. Scientists, before they went silent, had confirmed it. The planet's rotation was diminishing. The days were growing longer by measurable degrees. Soon a day would last weeks, then months, then years, then finally one long eternal dusk. And in this drawn-out twilight, the living things were falling into stasis. Frogs fossilized in motion, trees crystallized into glass. Birds that had once moved with the sun's rise and fall now sat unmoving in their nests, as if their instincts had been overwritten by something larger. Time was collapsing, not in a violent way, but like a deep sleep, a cosmic yawn. Whitby, who had once raged against it, had been the first to give in completely. Powers remembered the man shouting about entropy, about universal heat death. Then one day, he simply submerged himself in the tank and stopped, and the voices had grown louder ever since. The The symbols weren't warnings, they were invitations. Powers began to suspect the aquarium wasn't simply a remnant of old biological research. It was something else, built on something older, or perhaps accidentally placed at a convergence point, where time pooled, where thought lingered. The cactus outside now bore more names, strangers, but also powers again, deeper, more defined. The plant seemed to be confirming the inevitable, tracing the end over and over until it became real. One night, the sky above the building shimmered faintly, aurora-like waves moving slowly, almost imperceptibly. Powers watched from the rooftop, listening. No birds, no wind, just a deep rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat slowed to a geological scale. And then, as if someone had whispered his very cells, he understood. It wasn't just Earth. The stars were going out, one by one. All across the cosmos, light was dimming, suns were shrinking, galaxies no longer spiraled. Everything was decelerating, as though some unseen hand had lifted from the universal clock. There was no apocalypse, no explosion, no war, just silence. And the water beneath the earth, those vast buried oceans, those impossible aquifers and tectonic seas, they began to rise. Not violently, but with purpose. In the dreams that followed, Powers saw them more clearly now. Shapes within the waters. Tall, flowing beings made of glyphs and strands, their bodies drifting like deep-sea jellyfish. They did not speak, but exhaled understanding. They had waited a long time. As Powers stood near the flooded tank where Whitby still floated, he could feel the water pulling him closer. Sleep, it said. Not in words, in gravity, in warmth, sleep and return. The days turned inward, folding over themselves like waves closing on a forgotten shore. Powers, the biologist, continued his quiet routines, tending the remaining plants in the greenhouse, recording their demise, watching each leaf curl in sleep. The world outside fell quieter. Birds no longer returned to their roosts, insects slowed, then vanished. The clocks kept ticking, but time itself felt unsure of its footing. Whitby, his assistant, grew stranger by the day. He'd once been a promising student, but an accident had left him with a fractured mind and something more. An obsession with symbols etched in his dreams, spirals and circles that came to him underwater, in sleep, as if whispered by the drowned cities of Earth. He filled notebooks with these patterns, hundreds of them, obsessively detailed and increasingly unreadable. Powers didn't know if Whitby was being pulled into something metaphysical or merely spiraling out of human comprehension. There was a sense, however, that Whitby wasn't alone in his reception of these messages. Each morning, Powers swam in the drained swimming pool of the abandoned hotel next door, now a sunken monument to a bygone time. The sound of water slapping against concrete became his metronome. But one morning, he noticed something carved along the tiles, a series of symbols matching those in Whitby's drawings. They looked like oceanic runes, as if they had been scrawled by deep-sea intelligences. It unsettled him. These weren't figments of a damaged mind. They were appearing across reality. Later, Powers revisited the lab of Dr. Cauldron, a neurologist who once researched the patterns of human sleep and the sudden drop in infant births. Cauldron had become convinced that humanity was not evolving, but shutting down, each generation less vital, less awake. The sleep patterns of the last few generations had revealed long descending curves, as if the species itself was dreaming into extinction. Powers had dismissed it once. Now he wasn't so sure. In Cauldron's abandoned archives, Powers found dream maps, recordings of patients' REM movements. They resembled star charts, scattered with craters and troughs. At the center of many was a symbol, the same spiral Whitby had drawn, a glyph like a whirlpool collapsing in on itself. Cauldron had theorized that something, perhaps a galactic event, perhaps a signal, was triggering this, not just in humans, but across all living species, a kind of great cosmic yawn. Back at his home, Powers received a letter from an old colleague, Dr. Goodbody. It was long, rambling, but haunting. Goodbody claimed to have discovered an underwater chamber in the ruins of a submerged city. Inside were crystal structures, each one resonating with low hums, tones that seemed to speak in waves, as if communicating across time rather than space. He'd stayed too long in that place. Now, every time he closed his eyes, the hums returned, louder and louder, as though trying to lull him into something deeper than sleep. Goodbody signed off with a warning. We were never meant to be fully conscious. Not all awakenings are upward. Powers' own dreams deepened. He found himself submerged in a sea that spanned across galaxies, a warm and pulsing womb of stars and ink-black trenches. Beneath him, fish with translucent eyes blinked messages into his thoughts. In one dream, he descended to a bed of bones, gigantic, ancient, where a sleeping creature curled like a curled nautilus. It breathed once every century. Each breath was a tidal wave of time. When he awoke, his hands trembled. On his wall, he'd written something while asleep, a sequence of spirals, neatly drawn in black ink. He had no memory of it. The handwriting wasn't his. Whitby returned, more lucid than usual. He claimed that he now understood, that the symbols were not just language but instructions, maps for migration, not across geography but into a new mode of being. He said that the world was quiet because it was being prepared, like a theater dimming its lights before the show began. Powers asked what the destination was. Whitby whispered, "The core of the spiral." He vanished the next morning. The silence deepened. Powers began noticing other anomalies. Machinery stopped functioning for no reason. His plants now only opened at night. The stars above seemed fewer. At first, he assumed it was atmospheric interference. But satellite data confirmed it. Stars were disappearing, not from sight, but from existence. It matched what Whitby had described, that the universe was shedding unnecessary light, the outer rim of galaxies fading, drawing inward. It wasn't entropy in the thermodynamic sense. It was something else. A gathering. In desperation, Powers drove to the dry ocean bed miles away, where water once touched horizon to horizon. The cracked floor was now littered with fossilized marine life. At the center, he found a crater filled with a pool of still water, black and glistening, reflecting nothing. He felt drawn to it. He touched the surface. A ripple spread, forming concentric rings, spirals again. In their motion, he felt the same pull as his dreams, the same cadence as Whitby's voice. Beneath the surface, shapes formed, not reflections, but memories. His childhood, the collapse of the space program, the moment his mother died, all fading, softening, dissolving into something more elemental. That night, he didn't sleep. He floated in the half-drained swimming pool, staring up at the sky where constellations had thinned. The moon was pale, too pale, and then it wasn't there at all. Inside his mind, a rhythm beat, low and slow like a heart echoing across water. He heard languages meant for the ear. He felt weightless, like a bubble ascending. Everything inside him slowed to match. Time was no longer passing. It was curling inward. He understood now. This wasn't death, it was arrival. Here's the final part. Part 3 of the 3,000-word, 3-part sleep therapy-style recap of The Voices of Time by J.G. Ballard, written in an easy-to-understand, immersive tone, with seamless transitions and no structural headings or extra commentary. Powers walked through the ruins of time with a strange calm in his chest. Days passed, or didn't pass. The clocks in his laboratory had stopped completely, the second hands frozen at odd angles. It wasn't malfunction, it was as if time itself had given up the pretense of ticking forward. Yet Powers didn't panic. Instead, he observed, almost with reverence. The city around him had turned into a graveyard of forgotten rhythms. No cars, no dogs barking in the distance. Even the insects had retreated from the world. Machines stood cold. Radio transmissions were nothing but static. No voices, no signals from space, just silence, and beneath that, an eerie kind of waiting. He stopped sleeping entirely, but he didn't feel tired. It was as if sleep had become irrelevant. Or maybe he had already entered a different kind of dream, one that didn't require closing his eyes. Sometimes he would find himself standing at the edge of the drained swimming pool again, watching the black water ripple gently, even without wind. It whispered things, not in words, but in subtle pulses, like the echo of an ancient tide. He would see patterns in the ripples, spirals and waves, shapes too precise to be accidental. They were everywhere now, on the cracked walls of buildings, in the way vines grew along the fences, in the grooves of his own fingerprints. He knew Whitby had gone into the spiral, not metaphorically, not spiritually, physically. And perhaps it was what he had always wanted, to dissolve into the message that was hidden in the world. Powers began drawing the spirals too. Not compulsively, like Whitby once had, but almost out of devotion. He filled notebooks with them. Perfect, hypnotic, always centered. He didn't know what they meant, but each one felt like an echo of a larger truth, as though they were fragments of the same sentence repeated through space and time. One morning, he received a package. There was no sender. Inside it, wrapped in yellowing paper, was a single sheet, a coded list of star systems. Some had check marks beside them, so others were crossed out. At the top was a handwritten note: "The countdown is not for us, it's for the stars." He studied it carefully. The names of the stars were familiar, bright ones, ancient ones, but many of them had disappeared from the sky. Telescopes confirmed what his eyes could no longer see. They had gone silent like extinguished candles. It was as if the universe itself was running down, one system at a time. And still, he wasn't afraid. Because somewhere inside, powers had accepted what the others had resisted. This wasn't a disaster. It wasn't extinction, it was completion. The spiral wasn't a drain, it was a doorway. A shape the universe had always followed and was now finally entering. Later that night, he returned to his greenhouse where the last of his plants still lived. Or maybe they didn't. It was hard to tell anymore. Their leaves curled inward now, folding like tiny spirals. Everything curled. Everything turned toward the center. He sat beside them in the soft light, breathing quietly. Then, for the first time in weeks, he spoke out loud, not to himself, but to whatever was listening, if anything still was. "If this is the end," he said, "then it is the most peaceful one I could imagine." And just then, something changed. Not in the air, not in the light, but in the stillness. It was deeper, denser. He realized with a clarity he had never known that the voices of time, the slow unraveling of seconds, years, and millennia, had always been singing the same lullaby. It had been playing since the birth of the stars, a song with one ending chord. Now, that chord was about to play. The clocks did not start again, the machines did not come back to life. But the spiral, he could see it now, clearly, stretching across the sky, not in form but in feeling. It was no longer just a symbol, it was the shape of existence, of time, of the self. Powers walked to the pool. The water was still there, dark, impossibly smooth. He stood at its edge for a long time, watching his reflection, but it was not a reflection anymore. It was a doorway, a tunnel, the mouth of something vast and gentle. He stepped in. The water welcomed him, warm and deep, and as it closed over his head, he heard no splash, no sound at all, just the faint pulse of a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. It slowed, slower, slower still. Then he was floating, not in water, not in space, but in something softer, like a thought or a breath. Around him, time unspooled, not backward, not forward, but inward. It curled like smoke, like a ribbon, pulling everything gently toward the center. He could see Whitby now, or the idea of him, and Cauldron, and the others, not as people, but as pieces of the same wave, the same pattern. He was not alone, and he was not dissolving, he was becoming. There were no more stars to count, no clocks to watch, just the spiral, winding into itself, cradling all things. He understood. This had never been about survival, it had always been about return. The voices of time were never shouting, they were whispering us home.